Love. One of the strongest emotions there is. Love can take your heart to the top of the world or to the bottom of the ocean. It can make you feel like you're doing somersaults or like you've been broken. Now imagine being told by certain parts of society that you're not normal for loving a person because they're the same sex as you. Being made to feel like there's something wrong with you because of this. This can make you question everything. Do I tell anyone? If so, how do I tell them?
When I came out in 1995, it was quite an unusual thing, I suppose, that I came out in.
I knew that I fancied blokes, but I didn't really put gay as a label on that.
I was 35 when I came out.
Hello, my name's Ryan Colbeck. I'm part of the support group of Llanelli's LGBT community. One of the aims of this group is to provide support for members of the LGBT community. People are often told, oh, just talk, if you've got a problem, talk to someone if you're not sure. But many people never know where to go, who to talk to. Sometimes they don't even know what to say when they get there, if they do know. So the purpose of this documentary is to help people in supporting them, and the documentary follows the story of 4 people who share their experiences of coming out.
Right. When I was younger, I always knew there was something different about myself. There was never any doubt. All through school, my friends at school all knew that I was gay, but never came to terms with it until later on. Growing up, I always felt a little bit depressed and withdrawn due to this fact that I just wasn't out. I just couldn't be myself. Over the years, especially came into college, I started coming out then to all my friends.
Well, we're going back quite a long way now for me, because it was back in 1995 that I actually came out. But before that, I'd been in a very stable relationship, a very loving relationship with another woman, but we had not been out. We'd lived in different places with different addresses, but we'd been together a lot of the time, and it was quite a difficult time. I think people felt still very, very, very nervous about coming out. I think we were worried about what people would say. I think we did a lot of things to try to make it less obvious that we were together. And what was very strange, really, it was when I came out in 1995, it was because of the breakup of our relationship, which is rather ironic in a way, because you might think that just at a time when we no longer needed to hide our relationship because we no longer had that relationship, I actually started telling my friends about it.
So I grew up in Anglesey in North Wales, and I came out to my very first person, as in I told someone when I was 15 for the first time. And back in the day, I think the average age of coming out, when I was coming out, was about 21. And I'm that old that in those days you had to be 21 to legally have sex with another man. I knew that I fancied blokes, but I didn't really put gay as a label on that. Probably ever since I fancied people, so 11, 12. And I remember flipping a coin when I was very young, being quite concerned about fancying other boys, and flipping a coin and saying, right, okay, if it's heads, I'll stay with girls. If it's tails, it'll be boys. And it was that. And I think this is a sort of classic thing to do, but I think right in the early days I came out as bisexual. Before that sort of solidified and atrophied into the queer that I am now, which is a bit of a mishmash. But yeah, I remember a lot of angst and a lot of worry about fancying blokes.
Okay, my name's Nikki Herriot and I live in Mid Wales in Aberystwyth. And I came out in the early 90s, 1990s, in a small town called Machynlleth, which is kind of relevant to my story. It took, when I told my mum, she said that she asked me when I was a teenager, but like all teenagers, it's always another reason why you're going through a crap teenage life. So I didn't really pick up on that until after I was married. I got married to a man in the mid-80s, and within 3 or 4 years that relationship wasn't working. We'd had 2 children by then, and I went through the usual stuff of trying to work out why I wasn't happy. And it was basically a long process of elimination. Now in Machynlleth, it's in mid Wales, there's not a big LGBT community that I was aware of. So there was no one to come up to me and go, Nick, really? Or for me to see and go, oh, that's what's wrong. So it took about 3 or 4 years of going through everything as to why, wrong job, just had kids, unhappy, moved house, all sorts of things. And when there was nothing left, the only thing was left was, okay, I seem to be attracted to quite a few of the women that I knew in the area.
Well, what happened was I came out to Jennifer when I was 15 and then was silent for years, really, up until 19. Visually, I really was quite unusual and queer in that I never used to go out without my black lips and Edward Scissorhand hair, and I was the only goth in the village and attracted a lot of hassle. But I think back in those days, I remember having conversations about, is Pet Shop Boys gay? Is Boy George gay? No, he's not, he's just putting it on, sort of thing, And I think people genuinely didn't pick up the sort of cues that we do these days. It's certainly talked about and expected a lot more these days that people might be gay. But even in the, what would it been, late 1980s, with Bronski Beat and Erasure and Culture Club and Soft Cell, in our household there wasn't anything spoken about, and we were innocent. The most I'd get, I think, is a sort of rustling from behind the newspaper, back in the day where we still had newspapers, from my father in the chair. Yeah, so silent.
When I started working as a healthcare in the hospital, a few of my close friends from my work edged me to come out to my parents, which I was very nervous about. It was something that I don't know how they would take or how they would feel about it. So I was very nervous whether they'd be accepting of it or not. So back in 2012, I came out to my parents when I was in work. Through a phone call, I'd asked my parents not to go out for that evening and wait for me for when I get home, as I had news for them. Well, through a lovely 7.5-hour shift, I had 12 missed phone calls on my phone, as well as phone calls to the work phone from my mother wanting to speak to me of what the matter is. So I ended up having to leave the ward and to tell my parents over the phone when I was in absolute tears. And all I had from my mother was, "I thought as much." Staying on the phone, listening to my mother, speaking to my dad, all I heard was my mother saying was, "I thought as much, I already knew."
And so it was very helpful to have the support of my friends, but it was also quite strange because in that process it also became apparent that to some people we had been absolutely invisible. I don't know whether that's because as two women together, you're less obvious because women do things together, they go to things together, they go on holiday together, and nobody particularly questions it, because it was actually quite a surprise to some people that knew both of us that we were actually in a relationship together. And I think that's still true, that to many people, seeing lesbians in society, they're just not as obvious. They don't see them, and people don't have particularly, perhaps they don't have particular role models, they don't have particular storylines. Certainly back in '95, there were very few of those. Yes, we'd had Jeanette Winterson's Oranges Are Not the Only Fruit in 1989, but still the amount of representation of gay people was still very limited. And so I think sometimes as women we particularly fall below the radar and are particularly not seen. But certainly it was quite a difficult time to be in a relationship, particularly as we were both teachers and there'd been a lot of fuss about Section 28 and about what we should and shouldn't be teaching in schools, and a lot of very anti-gay propaganda, really.
Mainly, and I'm going to blame my brother here, and he knows that, because he, while straight, has always said that he can understand, he can always recognise a good-looking bloke. He always saw a good-looking bloke, he could say, that's a good-looking bloke, without affecting his sexuality. And so I thought, oh yeah, if I see a good-looking woman, or if I mind a crush, I thought that was normal in the straight world. It is, but for me it wasn't. And so after about 4 or 5 years, I realised that actually my unhappiness was because I was living with the wrong gender, I wasn't straight, and that I was more lesbian. And so I sat with that for about a year. I joined Kenrick, which is an organisation for women mainly based in England, but it was a newsletter I could get. There was no socialising around the area, so I had to do everything on my own. So I had to think about it. When I eventually decided, yes, this is what I want, I actually went away for a weekend. I found through a magazine called Spare Rib, which is a feminist magazine at the time, a B&B down in South Wales. So I just said to my husband, okay, I'm going away for the weekend. And I went away and spent time in this lesbian-run B&B, which also had other women in there, and just spent time with them, just relaxing, just exploring the area. But coming back, and after that weekend, I thought, okay, that's it. That is where my unhappiness is. I'm identifying wrong. I'm hiding something. So I then, about a couple of months later, told him. It was an interesting experience because he didn't believe me. He thought it was because he wanted. He then gave me a reaction. He told me some information which I cannot put out over the internet in case family see it. But he told me some stuff which he thought our relationship was going wrong. And I said, no, I'm not getting a reaction from you. I am lesbian. We are ending this relationship. It's not working. I no longer love you. I want to be with women, my next partner. So that was the process then of that long drawn separation of which anybody who breaks down a relationship has to go through. I told one or two of my friends, and they were really good. They said, we won't tell anybody. We'll keep it a secret, and we won't tell anybody. And I said, but the point is, I cannot live with secrets. That's what's affecting me. And that's why it was relevant to the town of Machynlleth, because it was a small town. I'd been living there for 10, 15 years. I was known in the community. I helped set up a children's nursery. I was working in the junior school where the kids were, running a youth club, helping with the youth club. And I just said to my friends, just get it out there rather than have it trickle feed, which is actually detrimental to me and the kids, and I suppose to my ex-husband. Get it over and done with, which is not for everybody. It depends on where you live. It's not a thing that I would recommend without a lot of thought. But I knew my town, and so the information went out. Within a week, I knew everybody knew. But it meant that If the boys got hassled at school, I went up to the school and I said, okay, as you will have heard, I've come out, it's true. The boys are being hassled because of it. I want the bullying. I wasn't really bullying then, it was questions. I want it to be answered, so that meant they were safe in school. There was an incident in the park where myself and coming out totally and in the nursery, one of the workers came up to me and went, oh, I hear you're lesbian. My sister's a lesbian. I'm moving to the area. Can I introduce you? So then I had my first lesbian friend through one of my co-workers. So we were walking through the park sometime later, and some teenage boys, about 17, 18, started catcalling me, and my friend who'd come out from the big cities was like, okay, we've got an issue here, we've got to move away, we've got to leave the park. And I said, no, we don't leave the park. You take the kids over to the swing park, I'll go and talk to them. So I walked over to the boys, sat down with them. I knew them from youth club, and I said, so you've heard I've come out? And they said, yes. And I said, well, it's true. And they went, oh. And they said, we thought it was just a rumour. And I went, if you thought it was a rumour, why were you shouting lesbian across to me? And of course, there's no answer. After that, no trouble. So my coming out was relatively easy in the community as a whole. Yes, it's not easy divorcing. It's not easy divorcing with children. So you've got the whole dynamics of separation, which no matter what your gender goes through, no matter what your sexuality goes through. The one issue I had was that because it was the mid-90s by then, the courts still were not in favour. It was the tail end of the courts not liking women being lesbian, looking after children, having their own children. So their father was trying to win full-time custody of the children using my sexuality against me.
Now for me at the time, I was also a town councillor in Carmarthen, and whilst I was happy to fight my own battle, of course I was also asking my party to support me, because as an out councillor, again, you're part of a team if you're part of a political party, as I was, part of the Labour Party, but I found my fellow councillors very supportive, they were very helpful, and indeed there was no worry at all about that. So it was all quite a strange process really, coming out, because it was at a time when I was at a very low point in my life, and I suppose I just was not really able to stop myself from saying things to people and explaining what had happened, and I did find that people were surprisingly supportive, and they did rally round, and I found that very helpful. But moving on from there, it was then fairly well known to people that I knew at that time that, you know, I'd had a relationship with a woman, people were aware of that, and then I became the MP for Llanelli, and I think many people at that time in the selection process, they would have been aware. But since then, perhaps because I've done lots of other things, and perhaps because I've really wanted to focus on being known for what I do, and have always tried, I think it's always a particular challenge for women not to be pigeonholed into this, that or the other, perhaps because of your appearance or where you're from, and you want to really focus on what you achieve and what you can do for people, what you manage to do to improve their lives. I haven't particularly mentioned it. I always said to myself that if anyone asked a direct question, I would always answer very clearly and say, you know, yes, this is me and this is how I am. But it seemed very much something that wasn't an issue. And then more recently there was an opportunity to take part in a photograph of all the gay MPs in Westminster, and it seemed wrong not to be in that photo, because it was to be a historic piece of documentation. It was to show where we were at that particular time in history, and I think it was very, very important that everybody should be counted. And so I thought, well, look, I need to be very clear about this. I need to say I want to be in this photo, knowing of course that because as an MP you have more prominence, this would attract a certain amount of attention, and then I would need to be prepared to deal with that.
And even in my first year at university, big hair, fabulous makeup, I had this note pushed under my door, and it said, I think you're really gorgeous, I want to have your babies. Meet me in the telly room at 8 o'clock tomorrow. So, signed Bill. So I thought, right, I've been rumbled. So I turned up at 8 o'clock in the telly room to find this short female Chinese rugby player called Connie, and she loved Bill Beaumont, and so she signed herself Bill, and ended up going out for 6 months. And it's fabulous. But when we ended, she got really down, threatened suicide, and it set me into a emotional tailspin, really. So all this stuff that had been bottling up for a long time started pouring out. I started self-harming. I had a special knife in my big black coat, a special little pocket on the inside that I used to keep it in, and I had this little ritual where I'd put on the Smiths and some incense, and I'd cut myself. Not immensely deep, but there'd be blood. And later I learned that it can release endorphins and create this sense of euphoria and relief. So actually I think I was on some level healing myself. I was taking care of myself. But it got to the stage, I remember one time I was in the communal kitchen and started cutting in the kitchen in front of everybody, and I think, I suppose Americans would call it an intervention. My friends staged an intervention, and I eventually ended up booking myself into counselling at the university counselling service, and I specifically said I would like to see a woman, because if it was a man, I was more or less guaranteed it was going to be a heterosexual man. They were the enemy. I didn't want to talk to a man. And they put me with a man. Looking back, I think he was a trainee, because I only had 6 sessions with him, and gave him a plant at the end. It's a classic thing you do to trainee counsellors. Trainees are always getting presents from their clients. And turned my life around. Amazing. I was allowed to say all those things out loud to a man, a stranger, that I'd never felt I had a chance to say to anyone. And I tell you, within 2 weeks of ending that 6 weeks of counselling, I'd gone back for the Easter holidays, come out to my mother. Got something to tell you. And she was hilarious. She blamed my friend when we were teenagers for stealing my girlfriend from me. She said, was it because I let you go and see the Rocky Horror Show so much? Very concerned that I would be dying of AIDS, because there was a lot of talk about HIV at that time. And I'd done some preparation. I'd got 2 books. One was a mistake, the other one was good. One was, they were both by Terry Saunderson. One was called Loving Someone Gay, How to Cope If Your Child is Gay. It's all very dramatic. I'm sure they'd rewrite it these days. But it was really good top tips for parents. And then the second one was How to Be a Happy Homosexual, which is aimed at the gay. I gave it to her to read anyway, and it went on about fisting and things like that, and she was like, oh no. So hilarious. But she very quickly took to it quite well and quite enjoyed having a gay. And my brother, on the same day, who's big roughy tufty, oh, that's disgusting, oh! And then calls up 5 minutes later, do you want a cup of tea? And he's been alright since. I didn't tell my dad. At that time my parents were still together. And I think my mum told my dad about 6 months later, when I wasn't there. And then years after that, I had a bit of a heart-to-heart with Dad and said, how do you feel about me being gay? And he said, well, I'm very proud, very proud. can't do the North Walian accent. Very proud. But if anyone asks me, I tell them. So I thought, oh, that's sweet. So yeah, I came out to my mum very quickly after counselling. Within a month, I'd gone to the LGB, as it was at the time, the Gay Society. Within 2 weeks, I was running it, because the woman running it at the time had to focus on her PhD and couldn't spare the time anymore. No one else wanted to do it. So in a big meeting of hundreds of students, I found myself putting my hand up. Yes, I will be Queen. And then I was very gay. You know, I mean, look out world, here I come.
Okay, yeah. It's interesting that you ask, how about the coming out? Because as you know, coming out is a 24/7. In fact, I live my life as if I'm out all the time. Just like straight people don't have to deny their sexuality. But there is a time when people say, oh, so how's your husband? And I go, actually, my wife. And you can see it or you don't see it. But during that main period where I was telling my friends and my family about it, about me changing, and then later on about having a girlfriend, it was interesting. So the first person after my husband was my mum. Well, actually no, I told my three friends, but then I told my parents via my mum. I took her on a trip when she was visiting and told her. She came back and said, well, do you not remember me telling you this when you asking you this when you were 19 or 20? And I go, no, I just thought I was depressed. I just thought I hadn't got a job. It was the mid 80s, Margaret Thatcher, blah, blah, blah. And she said, no, I asked you then. And she was fine with it. And I said, I did the usual cowardice thing. Can you tell Dad? He was not happy. He was not happy. Mum went away and she actually wrote me a letter, which I found the other day, where she said she was initially worried. A lot of people think, well, if you have the children, the boy, especially as I had two boys, there's no male influence. Where's the men in their lives? So they wanted their father's influence around a male influence. But then she wrote a letter saying that during the war, when she was a child, there were no men in her life because they all were either working in the factories 15, 16 hours a day, they were in national service, they were away. She talked to Dad, had to explain that he was brought up by women as well, and he turned out okay. I mean, I always laugh and say, well, you turned out hetero, and you brought me up and I ended up turning out lesbian. So Mum talked to herself and got it sorted. Dad never really got to grips with it, and he did support the boy's father, because he thought that if he supported the father and the father got the kids full time, he as a grandparent would still be able to see the children. And no matter what I gave to him, no matter what legal proof, it never worked. So I had to work. So that was a shame. Mum was on my side, but not. That was tough. Mum has since died, and Dad's new wife, totally supportive, totally on board, and has really helped him come around. And again, it's when you look back, they have to come out as well. Your children have to come out, your parents have to come out, because it's otherwise, especially when the town you've lived in, they've seen you get married to a bloke and then suddenly he's not around, but you're visiting with this woman. And people say, well, why do you have to come out? I cannot live in the closet. I was in the Territorial Army, and for 2 weeks a year I had to live in the closet. I struggled for 2 weeks. I cannot do it 52 weeks of the year. I am me. I am much happier. So my parents, it took them a lot of adjustment, and they weren't sure, and there was conversations, and it took them a long time to get their head around it. My brother, spot on. He said that he was now a cool dude because he had a lesbian sister. He's now got a trans relative down in New Zealand, so I'm second on the rung. I'm no longer top notch because one of his grandkids has a transgender auntie. But he is really cool and really with it. I mean, he was going to gay clubs before I was.
When I came out in 1995, it was quite an unusual thing, I suppose, that I came out at a time of grief when a relationship was actually breaking up. And at that point you are very vulnerable, and you do perhaps say things that you probably wouldn't say or you wouldn't dare to say in other circumstances. And I think that's how I came to tell my father, and in fact he did take it very well. He had read many books, and I suppose he was a person who had a fairly open mind to the world, and therefore I was lucky. I think with some people it might have been an awful lot more difficult, but then I think all of us have a slight anxiety about our parents, and perhaps in many cases they're much more open-minded than we would give them credit for. When I was actually putting myself forward for selection for Llanelli, I think there were so many issues that I thought other people would be much better than I would be, that in fact being out was probably not the highest item on my agenda. I thought for a start being from Carmarthen was probably going to be a massive disadvantage in Llanelli, and it was quite interesting really that the focus I suppose of my own mind was very much on, well, I'll do my very best, I'll say what I can say, I'll be totally honest with questions that people ask me, and if they decide to pick me they do, and if they don't, they don't. So I took a very matter-of-fact view of it because I didn't particularly rate my chances. I think possibly if I'd been much more ambitious in terms of desperately wanting to do something, perhaps that would have made me a lot more fearful. But I think because in this particular case I wanted to certainly say what I could do, certainly say what I'd like to do, certainly show how willing I would be to do things, but I didn't think, because I wasn't particularly, I thought to myself, I wasn't particularly someone who'd had the right sorts of training or experience to be an MP. I perhaps imagined that you had to have done different things from what I'd done. I suppose I just thought, well, I'll do my best. So perhaps it was a bit different for me than for some people.
I don't like a feeling that we can't say different things. And for me, it's my mum might call me a silly faggot, but she would mean it lovingly. Yeah, so it's a term of endearment, and you know, it's got to do with context. I don't think there are words that shouldn't be used, and I think if they're used in a appreciative, respectful context, then it's fine. You can use any word in a negative way as an insult, can't you? Any word, really. You expert. Buzzing. So yeah. So that's me really. 10 years ago I wasn't really looking, but found a chap via Gaydar, which is an online dating thing that I don't think anyone uses anymore. And it was supposed to be a one night stand sort of thing, and 10 years later, 10 and a half years later, here we are. Which is very nice. There was one time when we moved to near Crosshands, and we went to a local pub about 2 years after we moved there. Jukebox screeches to a halt. Everyone looks round. Oh, where are you boys from then? From just over the fields? Oh, which house? And I sat next to this guy. I was like, oh, I don't know about this. And I thought, is he being homophobic? Because I was really shocked because I hadn't experienced it for years. Oh, I don't know about this. I've got a problem. And he started going, it's not natural. I think I am actually being homophobically talked to, I thought to myself. It was quite refreshing in a way because I hadn't experienced it for so long. So I said to him, are you being, just to be clear, are you being homophobic? And he said, oh no, I don't agree with it. I said, did you know that People who express homophobic opinion, studies have shown, have been more likely to be closet cases themselves. Because they've done all sorts of weird and wonderful experiments attaching people's bits to machinery and showing them different types of porn. And the self-proclaimed homophobes got a lot more turned on by gay porn than people that don't have a problem with the gays. What are you saying? I'm saying that I think you're a closet case. And it didn't go down very well. But I really loved it because I owned him in that pub. He was weaker than me and he was trying. But I did end up thinking, oh, if I was a different person, that could have gone a very different way. And when I was a counsellor, and this is a really bad analogy, but I often used to say, being gay is about a bit like having a bad haircut. It's problematic, but if you walk down the street with confidence, you'd probably get away with it. And I think a lot of people, they need to just sort of grow into themselves and just pretend for a bit, see that it works, and then it will really be you, sort of thing. But after 10, 15 years of working with LGBTs, I think the two biggest problems, I think, that are the most easy to address are self-esteem and assertiveness. And those things can be improved by intervention, often relatively easily. And I think if we get those two things sorted, a lot of other things will follow from that. Self-esteem and assertiveness.
I was 35 when I came out. I wish I had come out when I was 18, 19. My wife came out when she was 16. She told her family, and they will never speak of it again. And she wasn't really out at work. She moved to a different area. So coming out much younger, and we're thinking about the youngsters we've got in the schools here. It is harder. It is tougher. I would say, don't leap in the deep end with both feet. Some of the youngsters I know tell their friends, you've got to trust them, because when it goes around school, it can never be brought back in again. So if you're thinking about it, if you're going that phase of am I, aren't I would say find one or two trusted friends. I mean, the internet helps. Now you've got that, you've got your magazines, you can actually sit with it. But equally, I remember the hiding and what it does, making sure you're not talking about certain things. You know, I used to dress, I've always worn trousers, always worn t-shirts and things, but I was careful of how I dressed, and that made me uncomfortable and unhappy. So I would say, find yourself a good support network so that you can get your outness in a group. Certainly in the Aberystwyth area, Machynlleth area, there are lots of events now. There's lots of groups, lots of social get-togethers, and we try and be welcoming. I mean, once there was like a couple of 18-year-olds, and then there was a lot of us in our.
I think whatever age you are, whether you're sort of, typically these days you'd be 13, I think the average, yeah? So you'd be noticing that something's up, and because gayness is talked about so much, you would very quickly, compared to my generation, come to the conclusion that you're bisexual, gay, trans, whatever. Or you might have been married to someone of a different sex for ages, or in your 60s, 70s, 80s, and thinking, I want to come out. I think the bit of advice I would give is, as a thought experiment, project yourself into 20, 30 years' time and look back on yourself and think, what advice would I give that person? And I often find that really useful for me because, an example is I found a photo of me when I was 16, topless, in the sea, on holiday somewhere, with a bandana and lovely locks, and looking absolutely beautiful. Absolutely beautiful. And I distinctly remember at the time really feeling that I was ugly and fat and no one would find me attractive. And I look at that photo now, that beautiful 16-year-old boy, I think, what were you on? You know, I mean, what you were seeing in the mirror is not reflected in this photograph. And I thought at the time, I'm going to fast forward, because I'm thinking, oh, now I'm fat. And then I think, well, I'm fast forwarding to me when I'm 90, looking back at me when I'm 43, thinking, oh my God, you are absolutely gorgeous. And I'm just fast forwarding and thinking, sod it, I'm just absolutely gorgeous. Give up that self-doubt. What's the point? It doesn't serve me. It doesn't serve me. Where's it come from? Examine it. Toss it out. So I would hope that if people went through that exercise of projecting themselves into the future and then giving the younger selves a bit of advice, then they would come to some. It may be that they say, in this time machine, oh my God, do not mention to anyone any of these feelings because it's all going to go awful. But I doubt that. An exercise I used to do with people, it involves films. So if people really were anxious and literally their gran would die of a heart attack if they came out to them, and I felt it myself, it's a very common thing to do. That is exaggerated thinking, because it's very rare for a gran to literally die of a heart attack when someone comes out. It may feel as if that's what's going to happen, but it's very rare. So a good exercise is run two films. So run two films. One of them is a horror, a complete nightmare. What is the worst case scenario that would happen? So I'm going to tell my mum, and she will, before she literally drops down dead of a heart attack, she will ring her mother and her sister. They will both drop down dead before my mum drops down, and she will call me all the names under the sun and tell me to move out and that she never wants to see me again, and they will say all these things.
Got home that evening, I chatted with my parents, and now I feel a lot better, a lot more energies with it, and a lot more open to who I actually am. And especially of late now, I am a lot more accepting and a lot more of interest on who I can be.
I certainly don't think it's easy now. I think it's always a real challenge for any person in any circumstance to come out and say that they're gay. But what I would say, I think we owe a huge amount to some of the pioneers. We can go right back to MPs like Chris Smith, who very, very early on were open about their sexuality. Now I think that's been a great help. So what I would say is, although it's never easy, there have been more and more people, whether they've been people in the sports world, like Nigel Owens, for example. These people really do help to break down the barriers, and the fact that they are able to say that they're out has, I think, made it easier for the next generation. But I would never ever minimise or belittle the challenge there is to talk about something like sexuality. I think it's very, very difficult. Particularly with people like your parents. I think people will always find it quite a challenge to come out. So it's not going to be easy, and I think there's a lot we need to do. But I do think that having more people in public positions who are able to say, look, I do this and I'm able to do this, I'm able to make a really good go of things in life. It's not going to stop you doing things. I think that's really a really important message. There's a huge amount to do on an international stage as well, and I think we've got a real responsibility in the world, particularly to help where we know that there really are some very severe forms of persecution and discrimination.
It's funny. Society has come so far, and there's never been a time when people have been more free to do what they want, love who they want, and care about what they want. And there's still the attitude in some corners that when it comes to love and sex, anything apart from a man and a woman is not normal. And think about that. No one likes to be disliked. There's no such thing as completely not caring what people think of you. It's not possible. Human beings are social creatures. And all of this goes on in your head. But the most important thing to remember is, no matter what happens, love is love.